Once upon a time, in the sleepy town of Suburbia, there stood a colossal edifice known to the locals as the Emporium of Provisions, but to the rest of the world, it was just a grocery store. Its vast parking lot stretched out like an endless sea of asphalt, with shopping carts scattered about like lost ships adrift in a chaotic ocean. Every Saturday morning, like clockwork, Mrs. Jenkins would embark on her weekly pilgrimage to this temple of consumption. Armed with a meticulously prepared list and a determination rivaled only by seasoned adventurers, she would traverse the aisles in search of sustenance for the coming week. As she stepped through the sliding glass doors, a wave of artificial chill washed over her, sending a shiver down her spine. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow upon the aisles ahead. Mrs. Jenkins paid it no mind, for she was on a mission. First stop, produce. She navigated her way through a maze of pyramids adorned with vibrant fruits and vegetables, each display meticulously arranged like a work of art. She selected the finest specimens, ensuring they met her exacting standards of freshness and ripeness. With her cart now laden with an assortment of produce, Mrs. Jenkins ventured deeper into the labyrinthine aisles. She passed towering shelves stocked with an endless array of canned goods, their labels a blur of colors and logos. Occasionally, she would pause to inspect an item, only to realize it was not on her list. She shrugged and moved on, the rhythm of her journey uninterrupted. Suddenly, without warning, the world around her seemed to shift. The once familiar layout of the store morphed into a nonsensical labyrinth of twisted corridors and dead ends. Mrs. Jenkins blinked in confusion, unsure of how she had ended up in this surreal landscape. She pressed on, her determination unwavering despite the bizarre twists and turns of her surroundings. She passed shelves stocked with peculiar items, jars of pickled tentacles, cans of unicorn tears, and boxes labeled Instant Happiness. She shook her head in disbelief, but dared not linger, lest she become lost in this strange realm forever. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the surreal distortion of reality faded away, leaving Mrs. Jenkins standing in the familiar confines of the grocery store once more. She blinked, momentarily disoriented, before shaking off the bizarre episode and continuing on her quest. Next stop, dairy. Mrs. Jenkins navigated her way through a sea of refrigerated displays, their glass doors fogged with condensation. She selected cartons of milk, blocks of cheese, and tubs of yogurt with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid and precise. As she reached for a container of cottage cheese, Mrs. Jenkins felt a strange sensation wash over her, as if she were being pulled into an alternate dimension. Colors danced before her eyes, swirling and shifting in a kaleidoscopic display of cosmic chaos. She reached out, grasping for anything to anchor her in this maelstrom of madness. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation passed, leaving Mrs. Jenkins standing in the dairy aisle once more. She blinked, her heart pounding in her chest, before shaking off the strange experience and resuming her shopping. The rest of Mrs. Jenkins' journey through the grocery store passed without incident. She selected meats, grains, and sundry items with the ease of a seasoned veteran, her cart filling to the brim with provisions for the week ahead. As she approached the checkout lanes, she couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. The odyssey was nearly at an end. But as Mrs. Jenkins stepped out of the store and into the bright sunlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey through the grocery store had been more than just a mundane errand. It had been an adventure, an odyssey through the surreal landscapes of the human imagination, and though she may never fully understand the strange occurrences that had transpired within those hallowed halls, one thing was certain: she would never look at grocery shopping the same way again. And so, with her cart full and her spirits lifted, Mrs. Jenkins made her way home, ready to face whatever strange and wonderful adventures the week ahead had in store. For in the world of grocery shopping, every trip is a journey unto itself, filled with twists and turns, surprises and delights, and the occasional brush with the inexplicable. And though the story may never truly have an ending, it is in the journey itself that the true magic lies. As Mrs. Jenkins pushed her cart through the sliding doors, she felt a sudden jolt, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She glanced around, half expecting to find herself once again lost in the surreal landscape of her previous encounters, but to her relief, everything appeared normal. She shrugged off the sensation and focused on the task at hand, navigating the aisles in search of the elusive items on her list. Her first stop was the produce section, a veritable cornucopia of colors and textures. She carefully inspected each item, feeling for ripeness and freshness with practiced precision. But as she reached for a plump tomato, her hand brushed against something unexpected, a small, furry creature nestled among the vegetables. Mrs. Jenkins recoiled in surprise, nearly knocking over a display of apples in her haste to escape the creature's grasp. But as she looked closer, she realized that it was not a creature at all, but a plush toy left behind by a careless shopper. She chuckled to herself, marveling at the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment, before tucking the toy into her cart and continuing on her way. As she made her way through the aisles, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been subtly altered, leaving her feeling slightly disoriented and out of place. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see bizarre creatures lurking in the shadows, but the aisles were empty save for the occasional shopper going about their business. Determined to shake off her unease, Mrs. Jenkins pressed on, her footsteps echoing softly against the linoleum floor. She passed shelves stocked with all manner of goods, their labels a blur of colors and logos. Occasionally, she would pause to inspect an item, only to find herself drawn into a whirlwind of confusion as she struggled to make sense of its purpose and function. At one point, she found herself staring at a can of soup labeled Essence of Dreams, its contents shimmering with an otherworldly glow. She furrowed her brow in confusion, wondering what sort of dreams could be contained within such a humble vessel. But before she could ponder the question further, a voice broke through the haze of her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am, do you know where I can find the enchanted almonds?" Mrs. Jenkins blinked in surprise, turning to see a young man standing beside her, his eyes wide with excitement. He wore a tattered cloak and carried a staff adorned with strange symbols, giving him the appearance of a wizard straight out of a fairy tale. "The enchanted almonds?" Mrs. Jenkins repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm sorry, young man, but I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." The young man's face fell, his shoulders slumping in disappointment. "Oh, well, thank you anyway," he mumbled, before shuffling off in search of his elusive almonds. Mrs. Jenkins watched him go, shaking her head in bemusement. It seemed that the strangeness of the grocery store knew no bounds, with each aisle holding its own peculiar surprises. But she couldn't afford to be distracted by such oddities, not when there were groceries to be bought and errands to be run. With renewed determination, Mrs. Jenkins set off once more, her cart rattling slightly as it rolled over the uneven tiles. She passed rows of canned goods, their labels a jumble of words and pictures that seemed to blur together into a cacophony of confusion. Suddenly, without warning, the world around her seemed to shift once again. The aisles twisted and turned in on themselves, forming a tangled maze of impossible geometry. Mrs. Jenkins stumbled forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she fought to keep her footing. But no matter which way she turned, she found herself confronted by dead ends and false exits, each path leading her further and further from her goal. She cried out in frustration, her voice echoing through the empty aisles as she struggled to find her way. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the distortion of reality faded away, leaving Mrs. Jenkins standing in the center of the grocery store once more. She blinked in confusion, her mind reeling from the strange experience. Was it all just a trick of the light, a figment of her imagination? Or was there something more sinister at play within the hallowed halls of the Emporium of Provisions? Shaking off her doubts, Mrs. Jenkins squared her shoulders and pressed on, determined to see her errand through to the end. For no matter how strange or surreal the world around her may be, there was one thing she knew for certain. She would not rest until her shopping list was complete. And so, with her trusty cart in tow and a sense of purpose driving her forward, Mrs. Jenkins embarked once more on her journey through the grocery store, ready to face whatever strange and wondrous adventures lay ahead. For in the world of grocery shopping, every trip is a journey unto itself, filled with twists and turns, surprises and delights, and the occasional brush with the inexplicable. And though the story may never truly have an ending, it is in the journey itself that the true magic lies. Mrs. Jenkins continued her journey through the aisles of the grocery store, her senses heightened by the strange occurrences that had plagued her thus far. She passed shelves lined with boxes and cans, their contents a mystery waiting to be discovered. Each aisle seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a harsh glare upon the rows of products that lined the shelves. As she turned a corner, Mrs. Jenkins found herself face to face with a display unlike any she had ever seen before. It was a towering structure made entirely of chocolate, its smooth surface glistening in the artificial light. Mrs. Jenkins stared in awe, her mouth watering at the sight of so much delicious confectionery. But as she reached out to touch the chocolatey masterpiece, she felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her. The world seemed to spin and whirl around her, colors blending together in a dizzying kaleidoscope of sensation. She stumbled backwards, clutching at her cart for support as she fought to regain her balance. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation passed, leaving Mrs. Jenkins standing in the aisle once more, her heart racing in her chest. She shook her head in disbelief, wondering if she had imagined the whole thing. But when she looked back at the display, she saw that it was no longer made of chocolate, but of ordinary cardboard and plastic. Baffled by the bizarre experience, Mrs. Jenkins pressed on, her determination undimmed by the strange events that had transpired. She passed rows of frozen foods, their icy contents fogging up the glass doors of the refrigerated displays. She selected items with care, checking expiration dates and nutritional information with the precision of a seasoned shopper. But as she reached for a package of frozen peas, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to ward off the cold. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the cold dissipated, leaving Mrs. Jenkins standing in the aisle once more, her breath fogging up the air in front of her. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see a ghostly apparition looming in the shadows. But the aisle was empty save for the familiar rows of frozen foods, their contents preserved in icy slumber. Shaking off her unease, Mrs. Jenkins continued on her way, her footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floor. She passed shelves stocked with household goods, their brightly colored packaging beckoning to her from every direction. She resisted the temptation to linger, knowing that she had a mission to complete. But as she turned a corner, she found herself confronted by a sight that stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a display of cleaning products, their labels adorned with strange symbols and cryptic messages. Mrs. Jenkins stared at them in confusion, wondering what secrets they held. And then, without warning, the world around her seemed to shift once again. The cleaning products morphed and twisted before her eyes, their labels swirling and changing in a mesmerizing dance of transformation. Mrs. Jenkins blinked in disbelief, unsure of what she was seeing. But before she could make sense of the strange phenomenon, the aisle returned to normal, leaving Mrs. Jenkins standing in the midst of the cleaning products once more. She shook her head in bewilderment, wondering if she had somehow stumbled into a parallel universe where cleaning products held the key to unlocking the secrets of the cosmos. Determined to put the strange experience behind her, Mrs. Jenkins pressed on, her cart rattling slightly as it rolled over the uneven tiles. She passed rows of snacks and treats, their colorful packaging beckoning to her from the shelves. She resisted the temptation to indulge, knowing that she had a list to stick to. But as she reached for a bag of chips, she felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her. The world seemed to spin and whirl around her, colors blending together in a dizzying blur of sensation. She stumbled backwards, reaching out for anything to anchor her in this sea of confusion. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation passed, leaving Mrs. Jenkins standing in the aisle once more, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see a crowd of onlookers staring at her in disbelief. But the aisle was empty save for the familiar rows of snacks and treats, their contents waiting patiently to be consumed. With a sigh of relief, Mrs. Jenkins continued on her way, her cart filled to the brim with groceries for the week ahead. She made her way to the checkout lanes, her steps slow and deliberate as she navigated the crowded aisles. She paid for her items with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that she had accomplished her mission despite the strange and surreal obstacles that had stood in her way. As she stepped out of the grocery store and into the bright sunlight, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment wash over her. She had faced the challenges of the grocery store head-on, emerging victorious in the end, and though the journey had been strange and surreal, She knew that she would always cherish the memories of her odyssey through the aisles of the Emporium of Provisions. And so, with her trusty cart in tow and a smile on her face, Mrs. Jenkins made her way home, ready to face whatever strange and wonderful adventures the week ahead had in store. For in the world of grocery shopping, every trip is a journey unto itself, filled with twists and turns, surprises and delights, and the occasional brush with the inexplicable. And though the story may never truly have an ending, it is in the journey itself that the true magic lies.